Good morning. Welcome to Sunday Morning Devotional, brought to you by Golden Isles Primitive Baptist Fellowship and Heart Floss TV. I'm Vernon Eckleberry, and this morning I have a lesson for you entitled The Power of a Tear. The Power of a Tear. But first, if you'll look over to your right, Brenda is going to sing for us a song that fits our theme this morning so well. God leads us along. God leads us along. Okay, Brenda.
In shady green pastures so rich and so sweet, God leads his dear children along. Where the water's cold flow bathes the weary one's feet, God leads his dear children along. Some through the waters, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the flood. Some through great sorrow, but God gives a song in the night season and all the day long. Sometimes on the mount where the sun shines so bright, God leads his dear children along. Sometimes in the valley, in darkest of night, God leads his dear children along. Though sorrow befall us and Satan oppose, God leads his dear children along. Through grace we shall conquer, defeat all our foes. God leads his dear children along. Some through the water, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the blood. Some through great sorrow, but God gives a song in the night season and all the day long. In the night season and all the day long.
Thank you, Brenda. And now let's look at our lesson entitled The Power of a Tear. The Power of a Tear. You know, there are all kinds of tears. There are tears of joy. There are tears of pain, tears of sorrow and sadness, and tears that we shed even in laughter. In the Old Testament, there was a king whose name was Hezekiah, who shed tears of desperation because he had contracted a fatal disease. And the Lord said, I have heard thy prayer, I have seen thy tears. And then there's a case of Esther, when she was afraid for the welfare of her people. She went in before the king and she fell down at his feet and besought him with tears. And then there is the tears of lament that were shed by the prophet Jeremiah when he said, mine eyes do fail with tears. He couldn't even see because of the tears in his eyes. In 1940, France agreed to surrender to the Gestapo any Jewish families that had escaped from Germany. A way of escape through the Pyrenees was devised that would allow the Jews to flee into the safety of Spain. It was called the Freedom Trail. In the story about that, called Tears, there were 20 people who were waiting in a shepherd's cabin for the guide to show up and lead them through the Pyrenees. There was a rabbi in the corner, and he was rocking back and forth and chanting a prayer. About that time, a little 5 to 6-year-old girl began crying, desperate crying. She was afraid. Her mother picked her up and gave her a cracker, and the crying stopped for now. The rabbi looked over and he saw just a little stain on the stone floor that was made by the tears that had dripped from the child's cheeks. And he said, "Oh, that Hashem will hear the tears of this child, as he heard the tears of Jacob and granted the blessing." Now, when I read that, I immediately thought, well, how does God hear a tear? So I thought we may as well go to Jacob, because that's what the rabbi mentioned, and find out how God heard the tears of Jacob and granted the blessing. Oh, that Hashem will hear the tears of this child as he heard the tears of Jacob and granted the blessing, the rabbi prayed. So how does God hear Jacob's tears? Well, we must go then to Genesis chapter 32, when Jacob returned home after serving Rachel's father for 20 years. And as he came close to the border of his homeland, he feared his brother Esau, because his brother had vowed to kill him because of his trickery. Well, Jacob, true to his nature, got together an abundance of livestock and had his servants offer them to Esau, trying to buy him off. And of course, as we find out, that wasn't necessary at all. Esau was already reconciled to his brother. Well, as night fell there, Jacob had his famous wrestling match that you're all familiar with. His wrestling match with God. And it's recorded in Genesis chapter 32, verse 24 and following. Jacob was left alone, we read, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of day. And when he saw, that is the person that Jacob was wrestling with, when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, Jacob's thigh. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then the angel said, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And what did Jacob say? "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." There is no doubt about two things here. There is no doubt that this was an angelic presence of God. In Genesis 32:30, we have the evidence of that. Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, and it meant, "For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." So there's no doubt that this was an angelic presence of God that Jacob wrestled with. And there is no doubt that as the outcome would be, Jacob received the blessing. And in verses 27 through 29, we read that angelic presence of God said unto him, "What is thy name?" And Jacob said, "Jacob." And God said to him, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel." And listen to this. "For as a prince thou hast power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." Power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And then later we read, "And he," that is God, "blessed him," gave him a blessing far beyond what Jacob was asking for when he asked for the safety for him and his family. So let's look then at the power of a tear. We might ask, how does God hear tears? And how does this apply to that experience of Jacob, where he wrestled with essentially God throughout the night? Well, the psalmist gives us a clue, gives us a picture of how supplication, that is, words where we ask God for a favor, how supplication is tied with tears. In Psalm 6, we read, "I water my couch," the psalmist wrote, "I water my couch with tears. The Lord hath heard the voice of my weeping. The Lord hath heard my supplication." So there it is again. We understand the Lord hears the words of the supplication, but what's this about him hearing the voice of my weeping? But you know, with Jacob, in Genesis 32, there are no tears at all there that we can see. We read that when he saw that he prevailed not against him, that is the angel, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and his thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And the angel said, "Let me go, for the day breaketh," you remember. And he, that is Jacob, said, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." So I ask, well, where are the tears? And how were they heard by God? Well, we must go to the prophet Hosea for the answer. This is where the prophet speaks of Jacob. And he writes in the 12th chapter of Hosea, verses 3 and 4, "By his," that is Jacob's, "by his strength he hath power with God. Yea, he had power over the angel and prevailed." Well, again, the question is, how can this be? How could Jacob, a man, have power over God? Well, Hosea tells us how. He writes further, "He, that is Jacob, he wept and made supplication unto him." You see, with the words, there were the tears. And it was the power of a tear, an earnest, sincere tear, that made his supplication heard and acted upon by God. There was Jacob's power with God. John Calvin said it this way, as only John Calvin could say it: "Weeping was needful for the patriarch, for he so gained the victory in the combat." That is, that wrestling match that he had through the night. Weeping was necessary, Calvin says, for through that he gained the victory. Now, what's the application of this to our lives? When we've exhausted everything else, a genuine, heartfelt, sincere prayer, and the shed tear that accompanies it, may speak to God more so than all the words that we may utter. It works for a child. She cries out to those that she believes can take care of her when she's hurt or afraid or lost, and she cries out not with words, but with tears. And this isn't taught. God makes us that way, because there's nothing that more readily gets a parent's attention than the tears of a child. That's the power of a tear. Even Jesus, and this is amazing to me, and this happens only because he's giving us an example in the flesh. On the night of his betrayal in the garden, Jesus exhibited this very thing that we're speaking of and gives it to us as an example. In Hebrews chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, we read, this is concerning Jesus now, "In the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. And this, of course, was Christ showing us how, in the pain and agony in the flesh, that it is through tears that God will often hear us louder than all the words. Christ showed us by his example that tears make a supplication louder than speech. But the good news is this morning, for you and for me, that there comes a day when none of this shall be necessary at all. In the new creation, the first favor that God grants his people in the new heaven and earth is that God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. That's in Revelation 21:4. Moved one last time by all the tears shed through all the ages, God wipes them away forever. And now may God be with you until we meet again.